I'm Rebecca Slayton. I'm the director of the Repi Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies. And I'm very pleased to welcome back our speaker for today. Professor Paul Lushenko is an assistant professor and director of special operations at the U.S. Army War College. He's also a recent graduate of the Cornell Government PhD program, just graduated in 2023, woohoo! And and has extensive experience in both studying and speaking about drone warfare, but also has actually been involved with managing operations, and so has a unique perspective. And now has a new book out, so that's what we're talking about today.
Well, what brings us here today, and that's this new book that we've launched, I guess, came out on the 20th. Oh, Chris Way, it's good to see you, sir. The 26th of January on the legitimacy of drone warfare and sort of adjudicating public perceptions thereof, and why might this be important. And we're going to talk about this in this brief, which will take again about 30 minutes or so. I will add that I'll do my best to kind of set key definitions, stay away from the military jargon. It's a whole language unto itself. But if you're confused about anything, please raise your hand, interrupt me. Pretty flexible in terms of that. So in this book, again, evaluating public perceptions of legitimacy, just published, what we do is take a look at the current state of the literature and identify sort of three main theories, if you will, surrounding drone warfare. And that is redefining drone warfare to the platform itself, which is to say an MQ-9 Reaper, an MQ-1 Predator, both manufactured by General Atomics in San Diego. There's also a reduction of drone warfare to targeted killing. And you've seen this on graphic display lately, but for the last nearly 2 decades in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and elsewhere. And then finally, also relating drone warfare to counterterrorism, which is sort of one key feature of a broader genre of irregular warfare that includes things like counterinsurgency, foreign internal defense, right? As opposed to those main sort of schools of thought on what drone warfare is, my co-authors at Williams College, finishing his PhD actually here at the Brooks School, we argue that it's best understood as a function of several observable strike attributes, the tactical and strategic use of drones, as well as different constraints, unilateral or multilateral. And so what do those things mean? Well, tactically is something that's conducted on the battlefield for discrete or limited military objective, like the use of a patrol or raid for the disruption of an enemy capability. Whereas at the strategic level, and what I teach our students at the Army War College, this is about linking political military end states to key ways and means or approaches and resources that enable those approaches. And so that is almost akin to the strategic use of a drone to decapitate an organization like Al-Qaeda or the Haqqani network in the FATA, the federally administered tribal areas in Pakistan and Somalia and other locations. Whereas on the other hand, the unilateral multilateral constraint really come down to internally imposed sort of standards of certainty surrounding civilian casualty outcomes. We can take a look at the near certainty standard under Obama, which we'll talk about here shortly. And then the multilateral constraint would be like UN approval for these operations, which is how, as you may have read in the first chapter, France conducts these operations abroad. And so when you bring together these two sort of pillars in the best of breed for political science, 2x2s of the workhorse of methodology, you get a really interesting typology of different emerging patterns of drone warfare that we can test empirically through data to include public perceptions of rightful wartime conduct, which is how we defined legitimacy in this piece, which is to say an empirical or pragmatic phenomenon that we can observe in the real world. And so we probe the merits of this theory through a quantitative research design that consists of a couple different key methods. So survey experiments, Monte Carlo simulations, Poisson regressions, and causal mediation analysis, which allows us to understand the importance of different mediators that exercise an indirect effect on overall attitude formation. And I'm going to talk about what that means in terms of the results here shortly. And what we do is we use these to test hypotheses that are informed by our middle range theory. Again, tactical strategic use, unilateral multilateral constraint, bringing these together for different patterns of drone warfare. And we draw data from the Obama administration, observational data from 2008 to his turnover to the Trump presidency. as well as respondent data from America and France. And why might we focus on America and France? Well, besides the United States, France, at least until a year ago or so, maybe less, was the only other great power measured against P5 sort of membership in the UN Security Council that would use these capabilities beyond its immediate borders and regions. And of course, drones have come to the fore in Ukraine and elsewhere, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and that conflict. But as a matter of fact, these capabilities have not been used widely abroad, except for in the case of France in the United States conducting these operations. And so we use this to test our theory. As we take a step back, I think it's important to sort of contextualize the history surrounding drone warfare, at least theoretically. And we do so by recognizing sort of 4 key pathologies in the drone warfare scholarship that you may have read about. The first is that scholars mostly draw on American attitudes when we talk about public opinion for drone warfare. And frankly, I think this is actually a pretty reasonable and understandable practice, right? Because the United States, as we know, is the most prolific user of at least armed and networked drones across the globe. An armed and networked drone would be like the MQ-9 Reaper, okay? The data for these operations as well is also better curated and gathered. Now, there's a lot of endogeneity or bias by relying upon think tanks such as the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, but suffice it to say, we don't really have key tallies over this data for France and other countries, Ukraine, for instance, like we do for the United States. And for, I think, understandable reasons with the amount of collateral damage which has resulted from these operations. Now, having said that, when you take a look at that data generation process, what we see very clearly is what we call in political science research selection bias. I mean, we are focusing on the United States at the expense of the evolving use of drones, not just by other countries, but increasingly so by other non-state actors, right? And so we see the Houthis in the Red Sea, for instance, one example par excellence from the very recent past here. The second pathology is that we largely understand drone warfare as a function of military bureaucracy. And I was just talking to Mavis and others. My next assignment here is going to be in the Pentagon, working policy for countering drones for the United States, but also for our key allies and partners globally. And we have a tendency to kind of reduce drone warfare to this classical sort of Graham Allison bureaucratic politics model, whereas we know that leaders in countries make decisions, right? And they scale up to identify with countries. This is the sort of key assumption within international relations scholarship. And so we can actually understand drone warfare as a leader-driven practice, meaning that public opinion could be really important to shape the way we understand these capabilities and how we use them. In fact, this is a well-established assumption within the literature. The third pathology that informs this theory is an exploration of key microfoundations, right? So microfoundations are the values and beliefs that underwrite overall attitudes. And these come in variety of forms, right? So cold or hot microfoundations, cognitive processes or emotions. And we can actually tap into these really indirect, unobserved microfoundations through interesting methods like causal mediation analysis. And that's what we do in this book. And then finally, the final pathology that informs this theory is that mostly public opinion researchers will focus on attitudes of approval and support as a key dependent variable in their analysis for drone warfare. And these cognate terms, approval and support, are viewed as really benchmarking attitudes, whereas we know that legitimacy is a really important, very consequential outcome for these operations that many scholars have talked about. But yet it's puzzling, we don't actually study legitimacy as a key dependent variable. I mean, certainly colleagues in Oxford and Cambridge will talk about it. We'll use case methodology and so forth. We actually don't use empirical, rigorous methods to study this like support and like approval. And I think, again, it's puzzling because people have talked about legitimacy being central to drone warfare. Our policymakers talk about legitimacy being very important for the sustainability of drone strikes, even when mistakes are made, or especially because mistakes are made. So who recalls the strike at the tail end of the US occupation of Afghanistan in August 2021, when we were withdrawing and we conducted a strike against what we thought was an Islamic State terrorist. In fact, an Islamic State in the Khorasan province terrorist. Turns out it was actually a collection of women and children that also worked for the occupation in an ironic twist. But And the fallout of that, the statement from then Chairman Mark Milley, the senior most official for the US military, was this was a righteous strike. I mean, that is a textbook definition of legitimacy, right? So we ought to study this accordingly. And furthermore, I will tell you, speaking and teaching at the US Army War College, our doctrine tells us that legitimacy is important. In fact, it's now a key principle of joint warfighting. But when you talk to our students, I don't think they really understand the complexity surrounding drone warfare in terms of variation in use and constraint, how that might moderate outcomes of legitimacy. And by the way, these are people who are going to stand in front of cameras and be at press briefings to justify courses of action. So the bottom line here is that on the basis of these pathologies, we claim that legitimacy is pretty central and it hasn't been studied rigorously in terms or in the context of drone warfare. It's not analogous to approval support. It's separate and it's essential to military operations. And I've said this before, but I'll say it again. There's a lot of contestation within the IR and American politics literature about the importance of public opinion. I mean, to what degree does public opinion actually matter in a democracy? And so we're tapping into the assumption, a bottom-up assumption, that is that the opinions of citizens can actually shape and moderate policy. And this, I think, is a well-established fact. There's a variety of sort of doctrinal versus anecdotal, responses here. If you take a look at military doctrine, both U.S. and joint doctrine, let's say NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and even the MTCR, the Missile Technology Control Regime, they will define drones in terms of classes, class 1, class 2, class 3 drones. I think it's probably easier for lay people, not that you're a lay person, you guys are experts in training.
A lay person.
To understand low tier, mid tier, and high tier drones, right? So low tier drones would be akin to like a commercially available, cheaper, easily weaponized drone. So the Chinese DJI is taking center stage in Ukraine. It's got a low cost barrier or entry, barrier, whatever, and it's being employed by paramilitary and indeed moms and dads, right? I mean, this is easy, right? And the first person view capability where you can put on like a IR sort of hat or whatever and, drive it into a target, the kamikaze loitering munition drone, that would be an example of low tier, right? Who's heard of the TV2 Barakatar manufactured by Turkey? Of course, Avi has, right? And you have too as well, sir. So this is the famous Turkish manufactured drone, went viral through a video in Ukraine about a year ago. Barakatar, you can see it online. This would be sort of a mid-tier drone. It may be networked and armed, of course, but the operational reach, how long it can go, how long it can loiter after being launched is a lot less than, let's say, a MQ-9 Reaper, which is the most advanced drone in the world manufactured by the United States. Furthermore, what that means is your payload is a lot less, right? So the munitions on there are a lot less. So we wrap it up to the high-end drones. This is what we're talking about, very advanced classes of drones that have a signature globally. And in fact, not just in the aerial domain, in the air, but also on land as well, right? With about 200 operators that it takes to fly a drone, which amazes people when you talk about it, right? So that'd be the MQ-9 Reaper. Very capable, can carry something like 6 to 8 munitions, 18-hour loitering time, persistent unblinking eye, very good optic. You can outfit this with other sort of capabilities, signal intelligence, push to talk, walkie-talkies, all the way up to cell phones it can intercept, right? And so mostly in this book, it's a really good question you asked because we focus mostly on public attitudes for those capabilities, those high-end capabilities, which means on the other hand, we're not dialoguing with the most consequential, potentially more consequential change in the character of warfare or how it's fought, which is commercially available drones. We have a tendency to conflate the tactical effectiveness of these capabilities. It can destroy a tank, for instance, with the strategic outcomes for war, like war termination, right? And so in that respect, there's a public ideation that these things are really consequential, whereas I think we got to step back and put in context of what they provide. In chapter 2, we define drone warfare, we define legitimacy, and we connect these two concepts together. And in doing so, we sketch out this typology. And the typology, I think it's important to understand because I'm going to use these definitions throughout what it consists of, right? So over-the-horizon strikes is really the preferred U.S. model, right? And this is sort of the tactical strategic use of drones with nothing more than unilateral oversight, like where we want to conduct it, when we want to conduct it, why we want to conduct it, for what reason. I mean, that's what we call over-the-horizon. Aerial occupation, sort of the strategic use of drones with multilateral oversight. And you can view that as akin to what happened after the Bosnian sort of conflict where we have a presence in the air domain with no boots on the ground, and it's with multilateral approval, UN approval, right? And so that would be what we call aerial occupation. Predatory strikes, and I'm not really sure if predatory is the right word, although we are militarizing what could otherwise be a law enforcement response within countries, is like the tactical use of drones with unilateral oversight, so within sovereign borders. And then juridical strikes, so-called French model, right, which is sort of the generating or motivating facts surrounding the study in part, is a tactical use of drones in multilateral oversight conditions, right? So with UN authorization. So we define these clearly within Chapter 2, and this is the conceptual framework that we derive hypotheses from in Chapter 3, and we test, right? And so what we do here is we survey representative samples in France and the United States, and we find really strong statistical support for several of our hypotheses, right? So first and foremost, we find that French citizens prefer what we call the French model, which is tactical strikes with multilateral constraint, regardless of civilian casualty outcomes. United States citizens prefer over-the-horizon strikes, right? But unless or until mistakes are made. So when given updated information that there's a civilian casualty, they would prefer a different model. And we can discuss why this may be the case later, but a really interesting puzzle to unpack. And so we define these again as juridical and over-the-horizon respectively. And I think what's really crucial about this chapter is that we can actually show that Americans and French citizens can identify their preferred model when given a randomized, sanitized scenario when no country is identified as such. So when given a randomized scenario where you have like country X or Y, and we present them with the model, they can identify their preferred models. And I think this is pretty crucial because what it shows us is that there are distinct and emerging patterns of drone warfare. The lay people, your mom and your dad, reporters, journalists who aren't really steeped in this literature or in this type of modality of conflict can actually recognize, right? And so this is a crucial sort of contribution to the literature. The other thing we do in this chapter 2 is we show that support and legitimacy can co-vary, which I think makes sense, right? But they can also deviate. And we call this a legitimacy paradox, which is akin to a trust paradox, what we can talk about later in terms of AI. And so in this case, we actually see instances of high public support for a certain pattern of drone warfare, whereas people may not view it as legitimate. And that actually relates clearly to the over-horizon strikes, which I think is fascinating, that American citizens in this case can support an operation conducted this way, but not find it rightful. We can talk about that too. And so what we do actually here is we take a look at causal mediation analysis. We say, okay, why might this be the case? And so for France, what we find is that there are really 3 indirect mediators that are shaping overall attitudes. So the perceived morality of a strike, a belief in the managerial role of great powers, and a preference for the use of force abroad. And if you take a look at the longer history of France, going back to the French Revolution, this actually makes sense. A bastion of human rights with the French Revolution, a post-colonial legacy, and especially Northern Africa. And so we're showing empirically what we observe in sort of the broad historiographic research on France and its interventions abroad. Now, on the other hand, and quite puzzlingly for America, we show that the perceived legality of strikes exercises an important effect for overall attitude formation. But think about that for a second, right? If we know that Americans prefer the over-the-horizon strike, right, as a first among others for these patterns of drone warfare that breach by necessity often an undeclared field of operations, which are not approved by the UN, which don't have ostensibly US boots on the ground, but yet Americans think that legality of the operations is most important to shape legitimacy outcomes. That is pretty puzzling. So we move on to chapter 4. What we do here is we take a look at one particular type of unilateral constraint. In this case, we call it the near certainty standard for no civilian casualties. And this is based upon findings from the previous chapter that US attitudes are shaped by unintended consequences. We draw data from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, for better or for worse, and there's a lot of bias with the Bureau. And my former doctoral supervisor, Sarah Krebs, who's here, kind of catalyzed this research agenda, as it were, has talked about that in a book called Drone Warfare, What You Need to Know, from Oxford University Press, if you're interested. But we take a look at a really radical shift in the management of these capabilities from 2011 to 2013 under the Obama administration. And this offers us a unique sort of design-based natural experiment setting to use some interesting methods. And our methods, which consist of Poisson regressions, which show sort of rate over time of change, and Monte Carlo simulations, where we're building kind of a fake data set to kind of tease out the implications of a counterfactual. We find three key findings here that I think are worthy to consider in this conversation. The first is, contrary to popular opinion, what we find from our structural break analysis on the data is that the Obama administration actually adopted the near certainty standard, which predicated approval of strikes in Pakistan, especially under predicated approval in the case of no civilian casualties, right? So he wanted his commanders to come back to him and say, you know what, we've mitigated risk against civilians to the point of no civilian casualties. It's called near certainty standard, right? And for the most part, most scholars will take a look at 2013 when he publicly announced this at the National Defense University as when that policy went to effect. But what we see for students of policy, I know you're at the policy school, Brett, is that there was actually a longer 2-year maturation process where the policy came on board around 2011. And we can show a drastic reduction in civilian casualties because of the policy. And indeed, Obama's intent was met. He adopted the policy to mitigate civilian casualties in Pakistan. So 2013 was a public statement because there was such a crescendo of blowback internationally for these civilian casualties. But he started to make changes in 2011, around July 2011. That's a key finding because within the literature, there's a lot of hum and han about what this policy actually provided, and should we adopt it as well within declarative operations like Iraq, Afghanistan. The second key outcome here is that, and I'll put more meat on the bone, is that, you know, the effectiveness was in terms of reducing civilian casualties by hundreds. We averted economic toll across Pakistan to the tune of $400 million. And importantly, there was actually no cost to the homeland in terms of an attack, either against and at the scale of 9/11 against the United States or key allies and partners, right? And this is important because most policy wonks of the conservative ilk will say, well, we're missing opportunities when we adopt a really rigorous, stringent targeting process like this. But the reality is we weren't attacked. Allies and partners weren't attacked at the scale of 9/11. Now, certainly there were knifings from Islamic State Khorasan province people back to Germany and France and elsewhere, but the scale was much less, right? So I don't buy the argument that we can't do this sort of standard with the declarative operations. The final thing as well that brings it central to the book's theme here, purpose, is that we take a look at the existing field research, some of which is published in our flagship international relations theory journals like International Security for the Belfer Center. And we can show that the policy shift from 2011 to 2013 for near certainty standard actually increased perceptions of legitimacy among Pakistani citizens themselves with the strikes. And I think this is pretty counterintuitive because there is a body of literature that says that in any case, these operations are illegitimate and illegal because they breach borders. But Pakistani citizens themselves, from in-depth interviews, hundreds of interviews, will talk about this period of time, resulting in a perception of legitimate strikes. Okay. Chapter 5, what we do here is we then talk about the multilateral constraint. And this is UN approval for these operations. And this is based upon our findings from France that they prefer multilateral approval through the United Nations. And we survey French and US people, and we find a couple key findings here, right? So the first is that we show that France does really appreciate the French model, right? Juridical strikes, so that's really important. We also show as well that in addition to those micro foundations that we sussed out in the previous chapter, for Americans especially, they prefer burden sharing, right? So offsetting the cost of drone operations by partnering with allies and partners for any number of reasons. Now, certainly these partners aren't going to operate the MQ-9 with US soldiers on the ground, but they provide what we call ABO, access, basing, and overflight. And in an era of coalition warfare, which Krebs talks about in her book, Coalition's Convenience, legitimacy of these operations become a really worthy, she says, a worthy end in themselves, notwithstanding some inconveniences along the way. And that's just not, you know, the politics at hand. It's also interoperability. I mean, it's really hard to operate across cultures, right, across militaries. But yet, Americans who don't really have a lot of military experience for the most part, well, because we were an all-volunteer force, less than 1% of the US population actually volunteers to serve. I mean, this is important to understand. We'll still recognize that burden sharing, given the depth and breadth of our responsibilities globally, is important for a variety of reasons. And so in the final chapter, we'll close this up here shortly, we recapitulate our findings and we discuss limitations and what some of those limitations consist of or first and foremost, what you talked about. I didn't catch your name.
Becca.
Becca, what you talked about. So we don't dialogue with like the cheaper commercially available drones. So our theory cannot explain nor predict any outcomes there. But I think personally, this is the more consequential unfolding implication for the character of warfare. We don't use longitudinal data. We focus on cross-sectional survey experiments. And so it's discrete. In some cases, it's the best we got. So there's a little bit of bias we have to contend with there. We don't, if you're keeping score, focus on the other patterns of drone warfare that we identify, aerial occupation or predatory strikes. We focus mostly on over the horizon and juridical strikes. And that's because of our unique comparative setting, which is driven by two great powers, France and the United States, that conduct these operations beyond their immediate borders and regions, right? But yet, I think someone ought to tear this apart from the other patterns because there's a generalizability question here that we ought to confront. We focus mainly, although we did talk about Pakistani citizens, on targeting versus targeted communities. But we know that the opinions from targeted communities are really important for the durability, the sustainability of these operations going forward. So there's got to be a lot more research done on what people who are in political communities that are affected by these operations think about legitimacy, what that means for US policy, right? And of course, statistical analyses are always chock full with assumptions. Right. And so there are a lot of assumptions that are made, that are embedded in these theories that, people could criticize one way or another. And so that's open for discussion as well. But I think ultimately we kind of push the methodological boundary as well as the conceptual boundary on how we can study public attitudes in the context of legitimacy. And for the first time that I'm aware of, at least, taking a look at an empirical research design to do so. So where might we go from this book forward? And I think this is an important question because there's a lot of opinion that we've kind of crescendo or reached our peak for drone warfare. In fact, when I came here, Sarah said to me, "Hey, Paul, why do you want to study drone warfare? I think it's really peaked." I said, "Well, I'm kind of, passionate because I'm in the military. I've managed hundreds of these strikes. I want to bridge theory and practice, but I actually kind of see novel production, novel employment. And so I think these things are going to be with us, especially because of the AI considerations and the autonomy considerations, which I'm writing about right now, and I'm happy to talk about. So here are a couple of questions that you could consider thinking about, studying yourselves going forward. So one is, what are the implications of varying civilian casualties for public perceptions of legitimacy, right? In our survey experiments, if you looked at the appendix there, we only vary one or none, high and low. And we did that pretty deliberately because when you take a look at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, on balance, the mean, right, is between 1 and like 7 civilian casualties, right? Any number of civilian casualties, to be clear, is a bad thing, right? It's one of the most important, if not the most important moderator in other research I conduct for US citizens' attitudes towards these capabilities, right? But yet we haven't fluctuated this higher or lower like we have for other swaths of literature in the nuclear space, right? So our risk ratio, the acceptable perceived number of soldiers to citizens killed or civilians killed, is really squishy for drone warfare. And there's implications for moral psychology, moral philosophy that we ought to tease out some more. And I know Brett's working on that in his dissertation a bit. How do citizens in targeted countries perceive the legitimacy of strikes? We've talked about that. Here's a tough one. Is public opinion for US counterterrorism drone strikes racially biased? So within the critical scholarship, Laura Wilcox and others, there is an argument that US public opinion for these strikes is racialized. And I think this is a fair on its face assumption because take a look at who these capabilities are killing. Brown, Black, and Indigenous people in non-Western countries, right? But on the other hand, as students of methods here, right, learning, there's also selection bias there. We're conducting these operations in these locations against these people. So how can we really tell that public attitudes are racialized? And so in some literature, which I've published already, and others, articles that are under review in some journals, we tackle this we tackle it directly rather. And we test two sort of key mechanisms that are drawn from the critical scholarship. And this is, I might add, a heuristic definition of race, not socially constructed, based upon sort of ideas of hierarchy and so forth, right, that prejudices folks, right, embedded racism, which we'll talk about. We take a look at skin color. We take a look at the actual location of a target. And we use an image-based survey design, varying both of those. And we have some really interesting findings. The most important of which is, yes, you can be racist and still support drone strikes, right? But it's irregardless of the skin color or location. You just happen to be a racist person based upon racial resentment, ethnocentric sort of worldviews. The other key finding is that when you provide more information to Americans on the skin color and location of a strike, right, you actually reduce public support at statistically significant degrees. When you don't, which is to say you dehumanize a target, you strip the target of its color through an IR or infrared optic, you don't talk about the location, you increase public support. And so the finding for me as a practitioner of these wares, but also as someone who's going to start writing policy this summer, is that the way that we present these capabilities and these strikes, the narrative surrounding this exercises a really important legitimation effect and has allowed political leaders, I'm speaking in my own capacity, by the way, military leaders to circumvent public accountability and democratic oversight, which is a leitmotif within the drone warfare space that you often hear within every article on drone warfare. We need more public accountability and democratic oversight. Every public opinion poll since 9/11 has shown high public support for US drone strikes, but they never clarify the skin color or the location. So there's an inflation of public support and opinion that's taking place. Anyway, those are some findings that I have that we can dialogue with going forward if you're interested. The other sort of questions that I have is the implications of the evolving patterns of drone warfare and the public's perception for the legitimacy of drone warfare. Matt attended a book launch, I guess about a year or two ago now, on a previous co-edited volume I had on drones and global order. I mean, that was the title. And that was an exercise of theory building, okay? We took a look at global order as constituted by 4 key pillars: the structure of international relations hierarchy, purpose of good, sovereignty, territorial integrity, the chief sort of norm, international humanitarian law, right, institutions, and then the diffusion of capabilities. And we said that when you take a look at each one of these pillars, we think our intuition is that there's complementary and contradictory effects for global order. Sovereignty is a great example. Take a look at Ukraine. We got to go to Ukraine. We got to get drones, right? Someone else's drones, at least, because we don't sell drones right now to US doesn't to Ukraine. We got to go in there because sovereignty is at stake, and this is the global order on a tipping balance, right? So, I mean, I think the intuition's there, but we can study this empirically through interesting conjoint designs that vary a lot of stuff in a survey scenario to see just how important this is. And then the final question here, which I hope we can talk about a little bit today, and takes us into tomorrow's presentation at the Tech Policy Institute, Brooks School, is what are the implications of fully autonomous weapon systems for public opinion, support, approval, legitimacy, right? These are capabilities which, by the way, we don't have in our arsenal. At most, we have semi-autonomous drones, which, by the way, really fascinating. Journalists are calling classical, like bygone drones right now, right? These are like the MQ-9 Reaper that can only fly certain GPS programmed waypoints, but will not engage a target on its own. What happens when we can do that? And by some accounts, that's already happening, tactically, at least in Ukraine. We have to study that a lot more. There's not a lot of public opinion research on that. I know you're leading the effort here, Brett, as far as I can tell. So suffice it to say, I think Crux got it wrong. In this case, at least, there's a lot to be done in drone war. Never tell her that, by the way. She's always right. There's a lot to be done for drone warfare, and this is just one small contribution. Hopefully it's a good one. I'll leave that to your judgment. So I look forward to any questions, comments, or considerations.